It was around 2015 or 2016. My younger sister was about 7 or 8 at the time, and we had just moved into a new house in Crestview to be closer to school and for cheaper rent. It was a pretty nice house, all things considered, and it even had a cozy fireplace for the winter. Anyway, my sister was really into Wonder Woman and had this Wonder Woman car that, if a button was pressed, made noises and lit up. It was basically her favorite toy, so she played with it often. Then one afternoon, she came inside from playing out back and told us she found something. Naturally, my mom and I asked what it was. It was a picture of a young girl, one of those tags you get if your parents paid extra for school photos. The picture was dirty and full of wear and tear, even to the point where you couldn't see the year it was taken. We thought, okay, some parents lost their kid's picture. No big deal. Then my sister said something that confused me. "That's Lily," she said. I looked at her with a facial expression that basically asked her to repeat herself, and she did. She pointed at the picture and said, "This is Lily. She's my friend." I slowly nodded my head as if I knew who she was talking about. The main reason this confused me is that my sister didn't make friends easily, and she had no friends that I knew of. Plus, this Lily only came up after we had moved. I shrugged it off, figuring she had made friends with the next door neighbors or something, and somehow got the school picture as a keepsake. That night, around 3 a.m., when everyone in the house was asleep, I woke up to my sister talking. Naturally annoyed, I walked into her room to tell her to go to bed, or else she'd wake up our parents. It was weird because when I walked into her room, she was sitting up straight in bed as if she were actually talking to someone, not just to herself or her toys. I told her to go to bed and went back to bed myself. A couple of days later, my mom was talking to me about my sister and asked if I'd seen her get up at night, and I said no. I just woke up to her talking a few nights ago. But that was it. "Why?" I asked. She said she had been acting weird, but as usual, we both shrugged it off as her being a kid. In my room, my bed was positioned across from the door, meaning that if I turned over, I could see into the hallway. One night, I woke up to use the bathroom. Since I was, and still am, afraid of the dark, I left the hallway light on, knowing my dad would turn it off when he got up, and I'd probably be asleep by then. As I was lying in bed, facing my door, a sudden noise made me jump. It was my sister's Wonder Woman car, making noises, so I got up to tell her she shouldn't be up this late playing. But when I got into her room, she was asleep in her bed, and the toy was across the room on the floor, still making noise. I walked over to it and turned it off. Over the following days, my sister wouldn't stop talking about Lily. It was honestly starting to freak me out. So I went over to the neighbors' houses on both sides. One house didn't even have kids, and the other was vacant. This started to worry me, but my dad said it was probably just an imaginary friend she had come up with. I went along with it since I couldn't think of any other explanation. But almost every night, one of us, my mom, dad, or older brother, would say we heard my sister's toy making noise and had to go into her room to turn it off. I explained that I had to do the same. I also brought up my sister talking to someone one night. My dad swore up and down that the toy was probably motion activated, but when we bought it, there was no mention of motion activation. My brother and I were so unnerved by it that we started sleeping in the same room, which I'm glad we did, or else I'd probably write this off as a bad dream. One night, my brother and I were talking, trying to keep each other calm, when we heard the dreaded noise of my sister's toy. We both looked toward my open door and into my sister's room, which was right across from mine. Our expressions turned to horror as we saw my sister's toy rolling past the door all on its own. We screamed and ran to our parents' room. They got mad at my sister, thinking it was a cruel joke, but what she said next sent chills down my spine. "It wasn't me," she said. "Lily wanted to play." That night, the toy went into the trash, batteries taken out and all. My brother and I were relieved, until the next day, when my sister had the toy again. My parents accused her of digging it out of the trash, but she insisted, "Lily got it for me." The toy was broken into small pieces and thrown away for the final time. My sister was obviously upset, but our parents got her a new Wonder Woman figurine, and everything seemed fine. It wasn't until about a week later, when we all felt things had settled down and that Lily was gone, that something happened. My mom was cooking chicken breast on the countertop George Foreman grill, and she had come into the living room to ask us something. Then we all jumped as we heard a crash in the kitchen. We went in there to see the George Foreman grill halfway across the kitchen as if it had been thrown. My mom swore it was nowhere near the edge, and my dad had no explanation. Nothing happened afterward, and we moved out about a year later. But to this day, I wonder if my sister's imaginary friend Lily wasn't so imaginary after all. This happened when I was a young child, maybe around 8 years old. My parents had me late, and my 2 older siblings were both at least 10 years older than me. I was woken up in the middle of the night by a commotion from downstairs one night. It was my parents. I cracked my door open and heard them freaking out about something, though I wasn't sure what it was. I went to the stairway and stood at the top, calling down, "Mom? Dad?" My mom came to the bottom of the stairs and said, "Go back to bed." I listened without asking any questions, but I could tell they were stressed about something. I tried to go back to sleep, but then I heard the front door downstairs slam shut, and it was followed by dead silence. I presumed they had left the house, but I wasn't sure why. Either way, I listened to my mom and went back to sleep. A bit later, I woke up again to sounds downstairs. It was the front door closing and then footsteps, but no talking. Naturally, I assumed they were back home and just being quiet so they wouldn't wake me up. I heard occasional steps and thuds from downstairs, along with drawers and cabinets opening and closing. I thought for sure I heard the fridge opening too. I figured it was my older brother, Mark, who's 10 years older than me. At the time, he was already driving, so him getting home late and rummaging in the fridge wasn't abnormal at all. These were all the logical explanations I gave myself for what I was hearing. Eventually, I heard footsteps coming up the stairs, getting louder and closer until they reached the top. Then they came straight to my door. My door quietly and slowly opened. I didn't sit up or move. I just had my eyes open, facing the door while I lay there. There weren't any lights outside my room. Whoever was walking around was doing so in the dark, so all I saw was a black mass at my doorway, resembling the shape of someone's head. I called out every name from Mark to Mom to Dad. Then I asked, "Who's there?" They didn't reply, they just closed the door, leaving me confused and mildly creeped out. I heard footsteps going back downstairs. I convinced myself it was my dad, just checking on me after getting home, though I wasn't sure why he was ignoring me. After a while, I didn't hear anything else from downstairs. Curiosity got the better of me, and I went downstairs in the dark. I kept all the lights off as I approached the kitchen. I froze in the doorway, noticing a tall figure standing right in the middle of the kitchen. I said, "Dad?" assuming it was him, just based on the size of the person. A deep voice responded, "Go back upstairs." I ran back up to my room, closed the door, and jumped under the covers. All I could think was, why did my dad's voice sound like that? The reality of a stranger being in the house didn't dawn on my innocent little mind. Not until later. Eventually, I heard the front door open and a commotion from downstairs again. This time, it was my parents. I went to the top of the stairs and they were shocked to see I was still awake. I asked what happened, and they told me that Mark had been in a minor accident, but was going to be fine. It wasn't until months later that I learned Mark had been in a car accident while driving under unsafe conditions. My parents had gotten a call from the hospital, so they rushed out, leaving me asleep. When I asked my dad if he had come into my room earlier, I learned they had been gone for hours. My mom freaked out, yelling at my dad because he had forgotten to lock the door when they rushed out. After I told my parents about the person at my bedroom door and in the kitchen, my dad searched the house with his gun, and my mom called the police. The last thing I remember is being asked by a police officer to give my story. My parents said they felt embarrassed, explaining to the cops that they had left me alone with the door unlocked. Nothing of value seemed to be stolen, and whoever broke into the house didn't seem to have any intention of harming me. Having a complete stranger in your house is already terrifying, but imagine going through that at 8 years old. My name is Jake. I graduated from New York University, NYU, in 2016. My college experience was perfect. I was part of a frat, managed my studies well, and spent just the right amount of time chasing girls. I'm still friends with a lot of my old frat brothers, and I recently got engaged to my fiancée, Lily, whom I also met at NYU. If you had asked me my opinion of NYU when I was a freshman, though, my answer would have been very, very different. What I'm about to tell you is one of the main reasons why I was never overly ambitious in high school. The NYU atmosphere was extremely foreign to me, and it was weird being surrounded by so many self-proclaimed high achievers. As a freshman, I was quickly swept up into the frenzy of career development and planning the next 30 years of your life as an 18-year-old. Silly, I know, but that was the nature of my school at the time. If you wanted to get any sort of offer in the business world, having a strong LinkedIn profile was a necessity. I can still remember the stress of cultivating a professional image online, as if my future hinged on which people I connected with and what skills I listed. Regardless, I checked all the boxes and began my search for a summer internship. It wasn't long before my inbox chimed with an actual meaningful message. To my genuine surprise, a prestigious business firm had reached out to me, expressing interest in my profile. It wasn't one of those bot messages either. The substance of the message indicated that it was actually written specifically for me. I read it over like 6 times before finally responding, and after a day of brief correspondence, I was invited to a first-round interview. I spent hours researching the company so I'd know what to expect during the interview, and prepared myself with all the sample questions I could find. Soon after, I got a message from a guy named Mark Nowicki, or what? I'll never forget that name for as long as I live. He stated that he would be my interviewer, and naturally, the first thing I did was some background research on him. However, my excitement soon gave way to puzzlement. I scoured LinkedIn for Merrick's profile, expecting to glean some insight into the person I'd soon be meeting. Strangely, I found nothing. No trace of his professional footprint, no social media, nothing. I shrugged it off, attributing it to a preference for privacy or something like that. Mark and I agreed on a day and time, and he gave me the interview location. I searched it up on my phone and realized that it was some random coffee shop in Brooklyn. This is when I started getting confused. Why would an interview not take place in Manhattan, where most offices were located? We had tons of coffee shops and perfect places for interviews in the city. Perplexed, I double-checked the address, but it seemed normal enough, so I didn't think much of it. The day before the interview, I told my friend Mike about the situation. He was even more confused than I was, telling me that the situation seemed fishy. I agreed with him, but I figured it was worth it for the position I might be getting. He asked me how I was getting there, and I told him I'd take an Uber. He offered to give me a ride since he wasn't doing anything at the time. I thanked him and accepted his offer. Little did I know, I might not even be telling this story if he hadn't offered to drive me. It was 4 p.m. the next day, and Mike rolled up to my apartment. I was extremely nervous since this was one of my first interviews. I got in the car, and we were off. 20 minutes later, I told Mike to drop me off on the street, as I didn't want to be seen getting dropped off by a friend for an interview. I thanked him, and he offered to wait for me. When I asked if he was sure, he smirked and pulled out a big bag of weed from his dashboard. I laughed, then shut the door. I walked a couple of minutes to the location and froze in my tracks. I looked up at a literal construction site. There was no coffee shop. Even stranger, the entire area wasn't residential at all. Most of the buildings looked closed or private. Confused, I double-checked my phone and confirmed I was in the right location. This entire block must have been recently demolished, so recently that even Google Maps hadn't updated. I pulled out my phone to call Mike, but before I could, a booming voice rang out behind me. "Jake!" exclaimed a deep voice. I whipped around and saw an absurdly tall man wearing an expensive black suit. Thank God, I thought, grateful that this wasn't some kind of setup. His presence was commanding yet oddly out of place in these surroundings. I should also note that the car he stood next to was a matte black Porsche. He walked toward me with a confused look on his face. We shook hands, and when I asked about the construction site, he said he was just as surprised as I was. He furrowed his eyebrows and put his hand on his chin. "You know what? Why don't we find someplace else? Get in," he said, motioning toward the Porsche. He walked back to the car and shouted over his shoulder, "Shotgun's all yours." Without another word, he got in the driver's seat and shut the door. I followed, walking around the car to admire it. But as I glanced into the back seat, a chill shot down my spine. Lying flat on the ground, obscured by the shadows, was a man. In his hand, he held something long and metal. Panic surged through me as the implications hit me. This was a trap. I turned away from the car and ran as fast as I could. I heard the man yell my name, but I didn't even look back. As I ran, the sound I was dreading came. Screeching tires. I shot a glance over my shoulder and saw the car turning in my direction. I had to think quickly. There was no way I could outrun a car. I reached the next intersection and had to make a decision. Left or right? My brain told me to go left, but my feet chose for me, and I sprinted to the right. I darted down the road, knowing I didn't have long. By some miracle, one of the buildings had a fire escape that looked low enough to jump onto. With all the strength I had, I vaulted upward, grabbing the ladder. I made it up the ladder, my heart pounding. The Porsche whipped around the corner and stopped on the street below. I couldn't see the driver, but I knew he was watching me. For the next minute, the car just sat there. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it sped off and disappeared. I pulled out my phone, called Mike, and screamed into the phone about what had just happened. He found me a few minutes later, and we sped off in silence. The aftermath was uneventful. I blocked it out of my mind and refused to talk about it, even with Mike. But sometimes, like right now, I can't help but recall every terrifying detail of what could have been the last day of my life.